War commanders in the Middle Ages sometimes did things so desperate that even modern historians had to double-check the manuscripts to believe them. There are chronicles describing war elephants fleeing from the screams of burning pigs, besieged cities dropping beehives on attackers, and armies hurling rotting bodies over the walls to break their enemies with fear and disease. Most medieval battles were fought with normal tactics: shield walls, cavalry charges, longbow volleys, and grinding sieges. But every now and then, a commander facing disaster reached for something completely out of the ordinary. In this video, we're going to look at those extreme moments, the strangest, most brutal and most controversial tactics that sources from the medieval world and its neighbors actually describe. And we'll separate what likely happened from what later storytellers exaggerated or invented. Before we get into the madness, do one quick thing for this brand new channel. If you like seeing the brutal reality behind medieval legends, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next battles and weapons we uncover. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? That simple comment helps this video reach a lot more medieval fans. Before we talk about war pigs flying beehives or catapulted corpses, it helps to understand what a normal medieval battle actually looked like. Because even without the insane experiments, warfare between roughly 1000 and 1500 was already brutal, terrifying, and full of tactical detail that popular culture usually skips. Most conflicts started long before the armies met face to face. Commanders chose ground carefully: hills for visibility, dry firm soil instead of mud, rivers or woods to protect the flanks. Sometimes the smartest move was to avoid a pitched battle entirely and instead burn crops, raid supply lines, or force the enemy to starve during a siege. But when battle did come, three elements dominated the way medieval Europeans fought: infantry formations, cavalry charges, and missile troops. Infantry were the backbone. In many regions, foot soldiers formed dense shielded blocks or spear hedges, locking together to create a wall that could absorb the shock of cavalry or push back enemy infantry. English sources from the Hundred Years' War describe men-at-arms dismounting and forming tight ranks with long spears and polearms, essentially turning knights into heavy infantry. On the continent, Swiss and Flemish pike formations became infamous for driving off mounted nobles who misjudged their resolve. Cavalry, especially heavy cavalry, still carried enormous prestige. Charges by armored knights could shatter tired or disordered infantry if the horsemen hit the right target at the right time. But by the later Middle Ages, commanders were increasingly cautious. Chronicles show knights being held in reserve, used to exploit gaps rather than as a blunt first strike. A failed cavalry charge could mean dozens of valuable nobles unhorsed, captured for ransom, or trampled under their own men. Missile troops added another ugly layer. English longbowmen, Genoese crossbowmen, and later early gunpowder units were deployed to weaken enemy lines before the main clash. At battles like Crécy and Agincourt, lines of stakes protected archers, who poured arrows into advancing knights until horses and men piled up in front of them. Chroniclers describe the sky darkening with arrows. Archaeology backs this up with armor pierced, bones splintered, and arrowheads lodged deep in skulls and joints. All of this played out over ground that quickly turned into a death trap. Once formations collided, visibility dropped, men slipped on blood and mud, and command systems began to fray. Trumpets, banners, and messengers were supposed to keep order, but many battles devolved into local struggles where small groups tried to stay together and not be surrounded. A single unit breaking and running could trigger a chain reaction, a rout that killed more men in flight than the combat itself. Siege warfare was just as grim. Instead of heroic ladder rushes every day, most sieges were long logistical strangulations, building lines of trenches and wooden works, digging mines under walls, rolling up wooden towers, and bombarding with trebuchets or early cannon. Defenders replied with countermines, sorties, and constant repair work. Disease and starvation often finished the job before a final assault. In other words, before any commander resorted to flaming animals or biological tricks, medieval warfare was already a carefully calculated combination of terrain, formations, morale, and supply. And it still looked like hell to the people living through it. That context is crucial, because the insane tactics this video explores usually appeared when those normal methods seemed insufficient, or when commanders were desperate enough to gamble on something that sounded more like a nightmare than a strategy. To start our tour of insane tactics, let's talk about the most infamous one: pigs used as weapons against war elephants. It sounds like something from a parody movie, but several ancient and late antique writers describe it, and those texts were still being copied, read, and believed throughout the medieval period. The key idea was simple and cruel. Elephants were terrifying on the battlefield, but they had a weakness: their nerves. Loud, high-pitched noises and sudden pain could make them panic and trample their own side. Roman and Greek authors say that commanders learned to exploit this. Pliny the Elder wrote in his Natural History that elephants dreaded the squeal of pigs, and that even the sound alone could throw them into confusion. The writer Elian, in his work on animal behavior, repeats the claim and ties it directly to warfare, describing how the shrieks of pigs terrified war elephants and made them uncontrollable. These are not modern retellings. They are texts from the first few centuries after Christ, copied again and again in monasteries and scriptoria. One of the most detailed stories comes from the strategist Polyaenus. Writing about the siege of Megara in the 3rd century BCE, he claims that the defenders coated pigs in pitch or resin, set them on fire, and drove them squealing toward the elephants of Antigonus Tsound. According to this account, the combination of flames, smell, and agonized screams made the elephants bolt, crushing their own troops and wrecking the siege engines they were attached to. Modern historians debate how literally to take this story, but it appears in a serious work of military stratagems, not a comedy. A later writer, the Byzantine historian Procopius, gives another famous example. Describing the Persian siege of Edessa in 544, he says that the attackers brought a single elephant to push a huge siege tower toward the walls. The defenders, desperate to stop it, supposedly raised a pig up on the battlements and made it squeal. The elephant, hearing the noise, panicked and backed away, ruining the assault. Again, the theme is the same. Commanders were willing to use any unpleasant trick they thought might unsettle these living tanks. So what does this mean for the Middle Ages? Technically, most of these war pig stories are set in the ancient Mediterranean world rather than in medieval Europe. But the manuscripts survived into the medieval period, and they shaped how scholars and military thinkers imagined warfare with elephants. For crusaders or Byzantine commanders who might face Eastern armies using elephants, the idea that pigs, or at least their screams, could disrupt them was part of the inherited toolkit of possible solutions. Modern scholars are cautious. Some point out that elephants could be trained to tolerate noise, and that ancient authors loved colorful anecdotes. Others note that even if the details were exaggerated, the underlying tactic, find a sensory shock that panics the enemy's animals, fits with many other documented battlefield improvisations. Either way, the image of flaming or squealing pigs turning war elephants into terrified wrecking balls is a perfect example of how far commanders were willing to go when they felt outmatched. If war pigs were a niche answer to a very specific problem, bees were the opposite, a kind of universal terror weapon that could be used almost anywhere people fought. From the early Middle Ages onward, beekeeping manuals, legal codes, and chronicles all hint at the same idea. If someone attacks your home, your castle, or your ship, you can turn your hives into living artillery. Bees were valuable property. Early medieval laws in places like Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England carefully regulated who owned swarms, how to compensate for stolen hives, and even how to divide honey between lord and peasant. That tells us two things. First, hives were common enough to matter economically. Second, people understood very well how dangerous an angry swarm could be. One Carolingian source even mentions punishment for deliberately driving bees against a neighbor, a kind of small-scale bee warfare before any army got involved. When you scale that up to sieges, the logic is obvious. Later medieval and early modern writers describe defenders dropping or slinging hives down onto besiegers, trying to undermine walls or storm gates. A study on the military uses of apiculture collects examples from Europe and the Mediterranean, in which beehives or wicker baskets full of bees were hurled from towers, rolled down slopes, or attached to small engines so they would shatter on impact. For soldiers packed tightly together under wooden mantlets or in rams and siege towers, suddenly being trapped with thousands of stinging insects could be enough to stop an assault cold. Naval warfare offered another opportunity. Chronicles and later compilations mention ships using pots of bees and wasps as missiles during boarding actions. Unlike stones, which might just bruise through armor, a shattered clay jar full of insects could force men to drop weapons, tear off helmets, and break formation in panic. Commanders didn't need modern science to understand that chaos on a crowded deck could be fatal. Not every dramatic story about bee bombs can be proven in detail. Some come from much later retellings or patriotic histories, but the underlying tactic is extremely plausible given what is known about hives, law, and warfare. Most historians who have looked at the evidence agree that using beehives as improvised weapons probably happened multiple times in real sieges, even if chroniclers only bothered to mention it when something especially memorable occurred. And like many of the strange tactics in this video, it sits on the line between everyday practicality and nightmare imagery. Commanders weaponizing a part of rural life that most people associated with honey, candles, and the rhythm of the seasons. Few images of medieval warfare are as disturbing as the idea of armies hurling rotting bodies over city walls to spread death inside. It sounds like pure horror fiction, but there is at least one famous siege where a contemporary writer claimed this really happened. In 1346, the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony in Crimea, was besieged by Mongol forces. During the siege, plague swept through the attackers' camp and killed large numbers of soldiers. A notary from the Italian city of Piacenza, Gabriele de Mussi, later wrote that the Mongols responded in a shocking way. They loaded the corpses of their own plague victims into catapults and hurled them into the city. According to his account, bodies crashed down inside the walls. The stench and fear were unbearable, and the disease soon spread among the defenders as well. Modern historians have examined this story from several angles. Medical researchers note that the bacterium responsible for the Black Death can survive for a time in tissues and in fleas living on dead bodies. So in theory, infected corpses could pose some risk. Military historians, however, point out that siege engines were valuable pieces of equipment normally used to throw stones or fire pots, not awkward human bodies that might break apart before hitting anything important. Because of this, many scholars see the incident at Kaffa as a dramatic but rare experiment, not a standard tactic of biological warfare across the Middle Ages. There are a few other hints that corpses and carcasses were sometimes used as weapons. Texts about siege warfare mention throwing dead animals into wells to foul the water, or hurling body parts and offal over the walls to terrify and demoralize defenders. A detailed study of medieval sieges concludes that commanders clearly understood the psychological power of corruption and bad smells, even if they had no real concept of bacteria or viruses. In cramped, frightened garrisons already weakened by hunger and disease, the sight of decomposing bodies crashing into the streets could be enough to push people towards surrender. So catapulted corpses did not turn the Middle Ages into a world of sophisticated germ warfare. Most victims of sieges died the old-fashioned way: starvation, overcrowding, contaminated water, and ordinary outbreaks of illness. But a handful of desperate commanders were willing to weaponize even the bodies of the dead, turning the battlefield itself into something closer to a plague-haunted nightmare than a simple clash of armies. Not every insane tactic involved animals or corpses. Some of the strangest and most terrifying ideas were simply extensions of normal siege warfare pushed to the limit: fire used in tunnels under walls, and burning liquids sprayed or thrown at ships. One of the most common ways to break a fortress was undermining. Armies hired professional miners to dig tunnels under enemy walls, propping the roof with heavy wooden beams as they went. When the tunnel reached the right spot, the miners packed it with fuel, timber, brush, pitch, sometimes even animal fat, and set it on fire. As the beams burned, the roof collapsed, the earth above slumped, and sections of the wall cracked or came crashing down. Chroniclers describe defenders listening for the faint scrape of tools underground, or watching bowls of water tremble from vibrations so they could dig countermines and meet the attackers in pitch-black, airless combat beneath their own city. Sometimes even the fuel source was shocking. A modern study of medieval mining notes that during the siege of Rochester in 1215, royal forces reportedly used dozens of pigs, bought of the fattest sort, as grease to make the underground fire hotter and more destructive beneath a stone tower. Here, pigs weren't running at elephants, they were being rendered into a kind of improvised accelerant to bring down masonry. Later in the 15th century, gunpowder charges began to replace pure fire in some mines, creating early tunnel bombs that collapsed walls or gates with a single blast. The basic idea, though, was the same. Attack from below, where defenders could barely see you coming. Out at sea, fire took on an even more nightmarish form. The Byzantine Empire developed a famous incendiary mixture known today as Greek fire, a thick petroleum-based liquid that could keep burning even on the surface of water. Contemporary writers describe specialized ships mounting bronze tubes on their prows, spraying jets of flame onto Arab fleets that threatened Constantinople in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. Other sources talk about clay pots filled with the mixture being hurled like grenades onto enemy decks, bursting into sheets of fire that clung to wood, rope, and flesh. The exact recipe was a closely guarded state secret, but modern scholars agree it probably relied on crude oil or naphtha thickened with resins and other additives. To the sailors on the receiving end, this must have felt less like a weapon and more like sorcery. Ordinary fires could be beaten out or smothered with water. Greek fire reportedly needed sand, vinegar, or even urine to extinguish, and sometimes not even that worked. Arab and Russian fleets destroyed by it left such an impression that later generations treated the substance almost as a legend. Yet multiple independent chronicles and analyses of naval archaeology confirm its very real and devastating effects. Mining and Greek fire show a pattern that runs through many of these insane tactics. Commanders took familiar elements of medieval warfare, tunnels, siege engines, pitch, oil, and pushed them to extremes, turning the earth itself into a collapsing weapon or the sea into a burning trap. To soldiers and sailors who lived through it, this blend of engineering and terror probably felt every bit as shocking as flaming pigs or catapulted corpses. After hearing about pigs, bees, corpses, tunnel fires, and burning seas, it is tempting to believe that every medieval war was a carnival of bizarre experiments. But a big part of your audience's mental picture actually comes from much later storytellers, Victorian showmen, sensationalist writers, and modern clickbait repeating ideas that are barely supported, or not supported at all. A good example is the family of stories about animal bombs that show up in popular articles and some modern illustrations. Plans for birds with burning material tied to their legs, cats carrying fire into rooftops, or even livestock packed with explosives are sometimes traced to early modern military manuals and siege treatises. In many cases, though, the surviving texts are vague. The illustrations look more like thought experiments than field reports, and no reliable chronicle describes a real battle where flocks of blazing pigeons turned the tide. Historians who study medieval and early modern technology tend to treat these as proposals, ideas someone sketched out on parchment, rather than as proven battlefield tactics. The same caution applies to some of the more theatrical torture-style devices and superweapons often labeled as medieval. Scholars who have gone through museum collections and 18th, 19th century catalogues have shown that famous items like the Iron Maiden, many spiked chairs, and some elaborate execution machines were either outright inventions or heavily rebuilt centuries after the Middle Ages to shock paying visitors. They tell us more about early modern obsessions with a brutal, exotic past than about what actual medieval commanders and judges really did. When cross-checked against court records, chronicles, and archaeological evidence, the day-to-day violence of the Middle Ages turns out to be grim enough without these props. So how should strange tactics be judged? Military historians usually ask three questions. First, is there a contemporary or near-contemporary written source rather than a much later legend? Second, does the method make basic physical sense given what is known about fire, animals, disease, and fortifications? Third, does it fit the social and logistical reality of the period? Could a commander really spare that many animals, that much fuel, or that many skilled miners? Tricks like war pigs, beehive attacks, corpse throwing, tunnel fires and Greek fire all clear at least some of these. Hurdles, even if the details were embellished over time, many other spectacular claims do not. In the end, that tension between fact and exaggeration is exactly what makes medieval warfare such a powerful subject for curiosity. The real tactics already blur the line between engineering and nightmare, and later generations kept adding extra layers of horror and spectacle on top. When those layers are peeled back, what remains is still shocking. But it is also human. Commanders under pressure, improvising with whatever they had, and soldiers on both sides trying to survive in a world where even the strangest ideas might be tried once if the situation was desperate enough. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.